We now move to Exodus 19 through 24. The key theme of this section is the covenant at Sinai, and whenever you see the word covenant, think the word relationship. Covenant and relationship are interchangeable concepts, you might say. Again, the earlier part of the book emphasizes deliverance. The last part of the book emphasizes covenant and relationship. Now they come to Sinai and Horeb, which are more or less synonyms for the same place. One might be the mountain and one might be the region. They will stay at Sinai from Exodus chapter 19 all the way through the book of Leviticus to the middle of the book of Numbers. It's in Numbers chapter 10 that they finally leave Sinai. But at Sinai, God will make a covenant which establishes a formal relationship between himself and his people. And the laws of that covenant will show the people how to live within that covenant relationship. Key passage is chapters 19 through 24, where the covenant is offered and then later accepted by the Israelites. You can see the outline of that passage. It forms a chiastic structure. They offered the covenant in Exodus 19. God gives the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, in chapter 20. And then there's a little statement about warning them, don't be so afraid so that you run away, but God has come so that fear of him might be upon you. A little bit ironic, talking about fear of God. Proper type of fear is the kind of fear that causes you to respect God's commandments and obey them. Improper is terror. Then there's more laws, the book of the covenant, and finally the covenant accepted. So it's bracketed by narratives that talk about the covenant offered and accepted. In between there are laws, Decalogue and book of the covenant, and in the middle of it is the section on fear of the Lord. Covenant begins and ends a chiasm because the main idea really is covenant. The laws are subordinated to the concept of covenant. And this is going to be important because the covenant comes before the law. That is, you accept the covenant and then you're obligated to obey the law. It's not that you earn your relationship by keeping the law. It's rather you express your relationship by keeping the law. And at the heart of keeping the law is the concept of fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord is that attitude of heart that causes you to turn away from sin and obey God's commandments. This covenant is unconditional. The offer of the covenant is not based on any merit or Israel having done anything. It's, if you would like this covenant, you may have it. Law keeping will follow acceptance of the covenant. If you accept it, then you are obliged to keep the laws. But they come after the law is accepted. And the acceptance of it is in chapter 24. Key verse is in Exodus 19, 5 and 6. Now, if you will obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, though all the earth is mine, and you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. Key concept here is, well, what does it mean for Israel to be a kingdom of priests? What does it mean for Israel to be a holy nation? Well, holiness has to do with being set apart, and Israel was set apart from the other nations, and that made them a holy nation. But the question is, well, exactly what's the sense of being a kingdom of priests? Does it mean that they were all to be priests? Well, surely not, because later on only the sons of Aaron could serve as priests. But rather, I think that this is going along with being a holy nation. that they were to be a priestly nation. Just as a priest is set apart from others to minister to non-priests, mediate between God and everybody else, so Israel was to be a kingdom of priests, or a priestly nation, in the sense that they were to mediate between God and the other nations. And this relates to the whole concept of election as we see it developed in Genesis and Exodus. God chose Abraham and now chooses Israel, not so that he could bless Abraham and bless Israel and condemn everybody else, but he chose Abraham so that he might be a blessing to the others. That promise in Genesis 12:3, in your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. That God chose Abraham so that eventually all the other families of the earth would find blessing. Similarly, God chose Israel to be a kingdom of priests, not simply to bless Israel and condemn the nations, but so that Israel could mediate God to the other nations as priests, as a priestly nation. Well, say some brief words about the Ten Commandments. We're going to come back to this in a future lecture. Ten Commandments give a summary statement of what God expects of people in the covenant relationship with himself to maintain. They're minimal standards that those in relationship in God should have. I mean, one of the standards is, well, don't kill each other. Well, everybody knows killing is wrong, but at the very least, don't kill each other. Don't steal from each other. Those are not really high standards of morality, but nonetheless, they do show that God is a God of morality that expects his people to live morally. Let me move on to, we'll talk about the Ten Commandments and its laws later. Let's move on to the Book of the Covenant, Exodus 20, 22 through 23, 33. This label comes from Exodus 24, verse 7. Probably a misnomer because that label includes all the laws, and that would include the Ten Commandments too. But scholars have tended to use that label, Book of the Covenant, to the laws of Exodus 20, 22 through 23, 33. And they're primarily civil laws governing Israel's national life. And they deal with topics also covered by ancient Near Eastern laws, such as the laws of Hammurabi, which came out a couple of centuries before Moses anyway, 1760 BC. It's interesting that the biblical laws, as compared with the laws of Hammurabi, and by the way, here's a stela that has Hammurabi receiving a rod and a ring from the god Shamash, symbolic of his authority to rule. And in the stele below, that's not shown on this slide, it has a couple hundred laws of the law code of Hammurabi. But in biblical law, much more emphasis and much more value is placed on human life than with Mesopotamian laws like the laws of Hammurabi. Now, I'll just give you a brief example of the kind of laws that are in the Book of the Covenant. There are laws about slaves. If you didn't pay your debts, you could become a slave. That's probably the main reason a person became a slave, was lack of being able to pay your bills. So if you couldn't pay your bills, you'd sell everything you had. If you had nothing left to sell, you sold yourself, or they sold you in order to pay your debt. Now, does the Bible condone slavery? Well, if you actually look at the laws, each one of them is meant to be humanitarian in its own way. So there's a law limiting slavery to 6 years. If you acquire a Hebrew slave, he may serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without payment of anything. Or later on in the same passage, if you deliberately kill your slave, it's regarded as murder. when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. And that word avenge, Hebrew word is nakam, usually implies the death of the one on whom vengeance is taken. So a person who deliberately kills his slave is a murderer. This was not true of Roman slavery, where your slave was your chattel property. If you killed your slave, you just lost your investment. Or if you maim a slave, you had to let him go free. If you knock out his eye, knock out his tooth, you shall let the slave go free because of his eye or because of his tooth. If you have a Sabbath, you're to let him to rest on the Sabbath. The Ten Commandments talks about that. And it even encourages giving slaves liberally out of your threshing floor and out of your flock to give them a fresh start when you let them go free. Now, we might say that having slave laws themselves was inherently problematic. However, every one of these slave laws was intended to help the slave. Don't work them to death like you were worked in Egypt, but give them time off on the Sabbath. They owe you their time, but they don't owe you their person, so you can't kill them or maim them, and so on and so forth. And so it's taking an institution that existed in that day and seeking to move it in, shall we say, the right direction. The right direction is moving it towards full abolition. So it's not true that the Old Testament thinks slavery is okay. It does everything it can, or does everything can short of abolishing slavery in trying to make it a more humane institution. We'll continue on the next lecture.